The morning Vera Colcutt stood at the center of the Harmon County Livestock Exchange, with every eye in the building on her. The temperature outside had already climbed past 104 degrees before 9 o'clock, and the air inside was no cooler for being indoors. It was the kind of August that had no mercy in it, the kind that cracked the clay hardpan of the pastures into a mosaic of pale plates and turned the stock tanks to warm, shallow soup. Ranchers who had laughed at Vera Colcutt 14 months ago were now crowded into that prefabricated metal building with their hats in their hands. And she could read the arithmetic of desperation on every face in the room as plainly as figures in a ledger. She had 23 registered Hereford cows in milk. Every man in that room had none. The man from Consolidated Western Genetics stood at the far end, near the auctioneer's stand. A laptop open on the folding table before him, a smile that had never once touched his eyes fixed in her direction, and Vera understood that the next several minutes would determine not only the shape of her life, but the shape of a great many others. She had not planned it this way. Nobody plans to be stood at the center of anything. But the land had been making this plan for 14 months. Patient and quiet as a thing that does not need to hurry. And the land always collects what it is owed. She let the room wait. She had learned to wait from the best teacher she ever had, and that teacher had 4 legs and cost $26 on a Tuesday in June. Cut back 14 months. Then, to the morning, the thing began. She had driven up from Borden County with $11,000 in a certified bank draft, which was the sum she had inherited from her grandmother, minus 2 months of rent and the cost of a used quarter-ton pickup truck, and she had intended to use it as a deposit on a modest parcel of improved pasture land near Giddings. That plan dissolved before noon when she learned the parcel had already sold to a crop insurance speculator out of Houston who paid cash and never left his car. What remained in the Harmon County Livestock Exchange catalog that Tuesday was a lot the exchange manager had penciled, in almost as an afterthought. 160 acres of cedar-choked, rocky creek bottom ground on the south fork of the Lisco Draw. The old stone house on the property described as structurally sound but heavily used. The timber on the land assessed at 0 because it was the wrong kind. The whole parcel priced at $9,800 because nobody had bid on it in 2 auction cycles. She bought it for $9,400. She had $1,500 and some dollars left. The bottle calf was in a pen at the back of the exchange. A Hereford bull calf of perhaps 3 weeks old, slab-sided and poorly, his dam dead of milk fever 2 days after his birth. The exchange had been bottle-feeding him out of something between professional duty and mild embarrassment. He was the son of a cow whose papers showed 3 generations of registered Herefords on one side and a cloudy unknown on the other, which is to say he was what auction men call a question mark, and question marks do not sell well. The starting bid was $50. Nobody bid. They dropped it to 26 and a man in the back made a noise that was not exactly a bid, but close enough to be recorded, then reconsidered and shook his head, and so the calf was technically sold to Vera Colcutt for $26 because she was the only one still looking at him. The men in the exchange did not laugh openly, but a few of them said things quietly to each other behind their programs, and one man whose name was Dub Fenwick said loudly enough to Carrie that she was fixing to learn an expensive lesson about the difference between a pet and a profit. She did not reply. She loaded the calf into the bed of her truck on a nest of straw and drove the 40 minutes to the south fork of the Lisco Draw and turned down the Caliche Road toward what was now, apparently, her life. The stone house had good walls and a bad roof, which is the better of the 2 conditions when you must choose. There was a windmill that turned when the wind moved, which in that county was most of the time, and it pulled water from 180 feet of depth that was sweet and cold and reliable, though she did not know yet how reliable. There were 2 corrugated tin outbuildings and a set of working pens made of treated posts and welded pipe, weathered but solid. The cedar was everywhere, dense and gray-green and aggressive. But cedar does not take water from the deep aquifer the way people say, and the grass underneath where it had been cleared in years past was still good browse, blue stem, and city watts grama, coming back along the creek edge where the soil kept some moisture. She walked the property the first afternoon with the calf on a rope lead, because she had nowhere to pen him that he could not simply walk out of, and she catalogued what she had the way a woman alone with $1,500 must catalogue things, which is to say without sentiment and without self-pity, only with clear eyes and the obligation to see what is actually there. She fed the calf twice that first day from a 2-quart bottle, and he drank with the furious single-minded focus of a creature that intends to survive. She named him in her mind, and did not say the name aloud, because she did not yet know if she had the right to name him, meaning she did not know if he would live. She called him Gideon after the place she had failed to buy, and as a private joke to herself about unexpected battles won with inadequate resources. The name suited him. By the end of the first month, she had spent $400 on formula and veterinary supplies and fencing materials, which left her $1,100, and she had patched the roof with metal screws and rubber washers in the rain, and she had begun clearing cedar on the south-facing slopes with a chainsaw she did not entirely know how to operate. And she had filed her registration paperwork with the American Hereford Association on Gideon as his own lot entry, which cost $60 and left her with an amount she did not write down, because writing it down made it feel like an accusation. The days were 16 hours long, and the work was the kind that makes a person sleep without dreaming. She was 31 years old, and she had a 160-acre rock pile and a bottle calf, with uncertain bloodlines and no one to say good morning to. It was Dub Fenwick who organized what he called a friendly concern over her situation at the Piney Fork feed store about 6 weeks in. She had come in for wormer and a roll of polywire, and the conversation in the store had paused when she walked in the way conversations pause when the subject of them arrives. Fenwick was a large red-faced man who ran 350 commercial Angus on the better pasture land north of town and was accustomed to being the largest voice in any agricultural discussion. He told her with the particular warmth of a man who considers condescension a form of generosity that she was welcome to sell her acreage to the Consolidated Western Genetics Land Consolidation Fund, that they were paying fair value for creek-bottom ground with water, and that she would walk away with enough to start fresh, somewhere flat and sensible, maybe buy some decent cows, with papers you could read all the way back. He made the offer sound like salvation. She bought her wormer and her polywire, and said she would think about it. She was not going to think about it. The man from Consolidated Western Genetics came to see her the following week. His name was Preston Garland, and he wore good boots that had never been in a pasture, and he had a handshake that was firm in the way of a man who has practiced it. He walked with her to the pens and looked at Gideon, who was by then 2 months old, and beginning to fill out in the shoulders in a way that was quietly interesting, and he said, in a tone of such gentle pity that it was almost an art form, that she was sitting on potential she didn't have the resources to realize, and that the fund could offer her $12,000 for the land and $200 for the calf, which he acknowledged was perhaps more than the calf was strictly worth given his papers, but they liked to be fair. She did the arithmetic silently. $12,200 was just barely what she had paid for the land and the calf combined, and he was presenting it as generosity. She showed him to the Kalish Road and said she appreciated the offer and would be in touch if her thinking changed. She was never going to be in touch. The neighbor, who came to see her in the second month, did not come to buy anything. Irma Stassen was 82 years old, had been born in a village in the Sudetenland, and had come to Harmon County with her husband in 1962, and had buried that husband in 1997, and had been working her own 220 acres of similar creek-bottom ground alone since then. Which is to say, she understood something about the arithmetic of a woman alone. She arrived in a truck that was older than Vera by 6 years, carrying a covered dish of something that turned out to be a Czech sausage stew, and she sat in the repaired kitchen and watched Vera eat and did not say much until after the food was done. And then she said, without preamble, that the land on the Lisco draw whisperers, meaning it speaks, but only when you are not asking it questions. She said the mistake people make with creek bottom ground is they try to impose what they know on what the land already knows, and the land has been knowing things since before this county had a name. She said the deep water here is not a complication. The deep water is the whole point. She said all this in a cadence that was gentle and slightly accented and aphoristic in a way that was clearly the cadence of a woman who had been saying true things for a long time. She looked at Gideon through the kitchen window and said, "That calf is thinking." Vera said she thought so too. Irma said the ones that think are the ones worth listening to, same as people. She left without making any large declarations, and she came back every couple of weeks after that. And the stew was sometimes a different recipe, but the philosophy was consistent. The boy appeared in the 3rd month. His name was Coy Dressel. He was 9 years old, and he arrived on a bicycle on a Saturday morning without explanation, and stood at the pen fence, watching Gideon with a focus that Vera recognized as the particular attention of a person who is looking at something real in a world that has not offered them much of it. His family's place was 2 miles up the draw. 70 acres of played-out pasture, and a house with a tarp on one end of the roof. She gave him nothing to do the first day, only let him watch. The second Saturday, he came back, and she gave him the bottle and let him feed Gideon. And that was when the relationship was formalized, which is to say Coy never asked if he could come, and Vera never said he should stop. He named the 3 replacement heifers she had purchased at the Fredericksburg sale in month 4, calling them Pearl, Ida, and the 3rd one simply Big, which was accurate. He named the older nurse cow she acquired in month 5 Mabel, which was also accurate. Vera had acquired Mabel because of something Irma Stassen had told her, which was that Hereford cows kept their milk quietly when they were comfortable, and gave it loudly when they were pressured, meaning the breed has no interest in performing for you, but will provide fully if you create the conditions for it. And Vera had begun to understand that what the Lisco draw ground wanted was not overgrazing and not aggressive chemical management, but a grazing rotation that matched the pace of the creek bottom grass recovery. And the Hereford cattle, when managed that way, did something that Vera had read about in extension bulletins but had not yet seen in practice, which was that they improved the ground they walked on through their grazing pattern and their waste, rather than degrading it. The bottomland grass responded with a slowness that was almost imperceptible week to week, but was legible season to season, and the creek bank that had been bare clay in June was showing a skirt of switchgrass by October. She wrote none of this down in a way she would share with anyone. She banked it like a heat source kept low and unannounced, the way a fire is maintained overnight, not by feeding it spectacularly, but by keeping a core of coals alive under the ash so that it never needs to be rekindled from nothing. Gideon grew. He grew the way some animals grow when the conditions finally match their nature, with a steadiness that looks like ease, but is really the result of everything being right at once. His conformation was exceptional in a way that even Vera, who was still learning to read cattle conformation with the careful study of a person who cannot afford to misread it, could see was not ordinary. His tuplan was flat and long. His hip was set deep and wide. His front legs came down from his chest like columns plumbed by someone particular, and his head, when he carried it up and looked at you, had a quality of composure that was unusual in a young bull, a quality that Coy Dressel identified without any technical vocabulary one October afternoon, when he said, leaning on the fence rail, that Gideon looks like he already knows how it comes out. Vera thought that was about right. Irma Stassen, the next time she visited, looked at Gideon for a long time without speaking and then said, "The ground grew him the same as it grew the grass," which was her way of saying that cattle and land inform each other, and you cannot separate the quality of one from the management of the other. The outside validator came in November, 8 months after Vera had loaded Gideon onto the straw in her truck bed. He was a stockman from the Texas Hill Country named Reese Ponder, and he had come to the area to look at a breeding prospect for a client and had stopped at the Piney Fork feed store and asked who in Harmon County was running registered Herefords on creek bottom ground, and someone had told him Vera Colcutt out on the Lisco draw, probably with the tone people used when they mentioned her name, which was a tone that contained a small residue of amusement. Ponder drove out unannounced and stood at the fence and watched Gideon for 20 minutes without saying anything. And then he said, "What do you want for him?" And Vera said she had not thought about it, which was true in the sense that she had thought about it constantly, but had arrived at no figure. And Ponder said that he had clients who would put $5,000 on a prospect with his build and his frame at his age. And Vera said she was not sure he was for sale, and Ponder said he understood. And he left a card, and he said if she decided to show him. The Lone Star Hereford Classic in Kerrville accepted entries through December, and she ought to consider it. She considered it. She entered Gideon in the Lone Star Hereford Classic in January, which required a $200 entry fee that she paid and did not think about afterwards, because thinking about it would not change what was in the account. She drove 4 hours to Kerrville in the third week of January, with Gideon in the trailer and Coy Dressel in the cab, because his mother had agreed to let him miss a Friday of school for an educational trip, and Irma Stassen had given them a thermos of coffee and a tin of kolaches for the road. The show was large and serious, with exhibitors from 4 states, and the registered Hereford bulls in the open division were the products of operations that had been breeding for show conformation for decades, and the men showing them had the unhurried manner of people who expect to win and are mildly irritated by having to wait for the judge to confirm it. They looked at Gideon with the professional assessment of people who know exactly what they are looking at, and several of them looked at Vera with the separate assessment of people who are deciding what category to place her in. The judge was a woman named Clara Henning from Nebraska, who had been evaluating cattle at shows for 30 years, and whose reputation was for calling what she saw without reference to whose trailer it had come out of. She took her time with each bull in the ring, and when she came to Gideon, she stopped longer than she had stopped anywhere else, and she asked Vera to walk him out and bring him back, and she watched the whole arc of his movement, and then she pointed to the center of the ring. Gideon stood at halter in the center of the show ring at the Lone Star Hereford Classic, and Clara Henning placed the Grand Champion ribbon on his halter and said to the assembled exhibitors, with the directness of a person who does not feel the need to perform her reasoning, that she had not seen a bull of this age, with this depth of body and this correctness of movement, in several years of judging this event, and she asked where he came from. Vera said Harmon County, and Henning said, "What operation?" And Vera said, with the plain steadiness that was her only register, "Mine." Coy Dressel, sitting in the bleachers, said nothing, but ate 3 kolaches in a row, which was his version of celebration. Vera did not cry until she was in the truck cab with the trailer hooked and the parking lot quiet around her, and then she cried for about 90 seconds, which was the appropriate duration, and then she drove home. The validation arrived in the only language Harmon County understood, which is the language of a number. And the number was $6,200 for his first straw of semen collected at the University Veterinary Extension Facility in College Station, purchased by Reese Ponder's client before Gideon was 13 months old. Vera deposited the check with the feeling of a person who has been keeping a secret for a long time and has finally been given permission to acknowledge it, but she told no one in Harmon County about the payment. She let them keep their pity a little longer. There was a use for it still. In the spring, she leased Gideon's genetics to 4 operations in adjacent counties, at rates that she had researched in the American Hereford Association's registry of prevailing fees, and priced accordingly, which is to say, fairly and without apology. She used the income to pay for 2 more registered Hereford heifers, and for the fence repair on the north section, and for the drilling of a monitoring well to confirm the depth and flow rate of the aquifer beneath the Lisco draw ground, a task she had been putting off and that now confirmed what she had guessed, which was that the water table beneath her, 160 acres, was a rechargeable shallow aquifer fed by the draw's catchment, consistent and deep enough to run the windmill indefinitely and to supply a small additional water infrastructure if she wished it. She did not broadcast this information. Gideon won the Lone Star Hereford Classic again, at 2 years old, and again at 3 years old, at which point his 3 consecutive Grand Champion designations made him a significant name in the registered Hereford world, and his genetics a known commodity. Which is to say, the demand for his straw was consistent and the price was no longer a surprise to anyone in the business, only to the people of Harmon County, who had been successfully kept from the information that Preston Garland was extremely interested in the number. He had made 2 more visits to the Lisco draw in the intervening months, each time with a higher offer for the land and for Gideon's breeding rights, each time with the same practice warmth and the same fundamental error, which was that he kept assuming the thing that would move Vera was money, when the thing that would have moved Vera was fair dealing. And those are not the same thing. The drought arrived in the July of Vera's second summer on the Lisco draw, with exactly the quality that Irma Stassen had once described as the way a crisis finds you when you are in the middle of something else, which is suddenly and without apology. The National Weather Service called it a record event for the region, which is a bureaucratic way of saying that by the end of the 4th week without rain, the stock tanks that Dub Fenwick's commercial Angus operation depended on had dropped to 18 inches of sludge, and his well was cycling sand. And by the end of the 6th week, the grass on the improved pastures north of town was gray and curling, and the ground had that pale fracture pattern that means the root moisture is gone, not just the surface. Fenwick had 350 head of commercial Angus that needed water and forage and had neither. And the going rate for hay had tripled in 10 days, as the drought declaration moved north and east and the regional supply compressed. Consolidated Western Genetics, to no one's great surprise, had been acquiring water rights and hay contracts for 6 months in advance of the drought, a pattern that was either extraordinary foresight or foreknowledge of the kind that requires insider access to Weather Service long-range modeling data. And Preston Garland was in the county seat every other day with paperwork for desperate ranchers, offering to assume their notes and their water obligations in exchange for long-term land management agreements that were written in language that meant, in plain terms, that the land did not go back to its owners when the drought broke. The County Agricultural Extension Office received 4 such agreements in the first 2 weeks of August and sent copies to the State Agriculture Department with a cover note expressing concern, which is the Extension Office's version of sounding an alarm. The grass on the Lisco draw did not gray and curl. The creek-bottom switchgrass that had established itself along the bank stayed green 2 weeks past everything else in the county. Not because Vera had done anything extraordinary, but because the grazing rotation she had maintained had allowed the root system to develop the depth that creek-bottom grass wants to develop when it is not overused. And the windmill ran continuously on the aquifer that had not dropped. And the Hereford cows, being managed the way Irma Stassen had described and the land had confirmed, were not stressed in the way that the commercial Angus north of town were stressed, and their milk had not dropped. She had 23 cows in milk. She had hay stored in the corrugated outbuildings from the winter cutting that she had baled and stored rather than selling, because the arithmetic of having it seemed better than the arithmetic of selling it. She had, in other words, enough. It was Dub Fenwick who came to her first. He drove up the Caliche Road on a Thursday morning in the 2nd week of August and sat in his truck for a moment before he got out, which was the moment in which he was arranging his face into something that could ask what he needed to ask. He was a large man who had spent 30 years being the largest voice in the room, and the arrangement took a moment. He came to the porch and said he had a situation with his water and his feed, that his stock were losing condition fast, and that he was not able to buy what he needed at the current market rate. And he asked, without quite meeting her eyes directly, whether she had hay she could sell, and whether she knew of anyone who might truck water to his tanks. She could see what it had cost him to drive the Caliche Road. She said she had hay at the going rate, and she said she would sell it to him at what she had paid for the baling, not at what it was worth in the current market, which was about 40% less than he could have found it elsewhere if he could have found it at all. She said she would need payment within 30 days. He said, "Thank you, with a brevity that held, she thought, the whole weight of the previous 14 months. And she said there was no need for that, and she told him to bring his truck on Saturday. Water moved the way word moves in small counties, which is like creek water finding its level, inexorable and without announcement, and by the end of that week, she had requests from 7 additional operations. She was not able to supply them all equally, but she did what she could, and she priced everything at cost or below, and she told each one the same thing, which was that she needed payment in 30 days and that she would take partial payment if that was what was possible. And that her cows were still milking and she had water, and if anyone had a bottle calf or a weak calf that needed supplementing, they should bring it out and she would see what she could do. Coy Dressel was at the Lisco draw every day that August, school being out, and he fed and watered and moved polywire with a competence that had accumulated over 14 months of Saturdays into something that looked like mastery. He said one afternoon, watching a line of pickup trucks turn down the Caliche Road, that there sure were a lot of people who used to not come here, now coming here. And Vera said that was generally how it went when what was here turned out to be needed. He said he thought it was something that the worst summer anybody could remember was the best summer for the creek grass. And Vera said she thought it was not magic exactly, only listening, which was Irma Stassen's word and the right word. It was Irma who told Vera what Preston Garland had done. She came by on a Tuesday with a jar of pickled green tomatoes and a piece of information, which was that Garland had been in the county records office and had pulled Vera's deed and her well permit and her extension office soil survey and had told 3 separate ranchers, in the context of discussing their distress, that the Lisco Draw operation was a small-scale experimental setup without the infrastructure to supply the county's needs, and that anyone counting on her hay and her water for the season was taking on risk they could not afford, and he had suggested that the fund's consolidated operation, once properly established, and Doddix would be able to address water needs for the region on a dependable professional basis. He had also, Irma said, apparently told one of the ranchers that Vera's well depth was 130 feet, not 180, which was wrong, and which was the kind of precise wrong number that means someone had read the permit incorrectly or had read it correctly and was misquoting it deliberately. And in either case, it was a number that no one outside of Vera's permit filing had access to, which meant he had been in the permit filing. She thought about that for a day. The county agent called a drought relief meeting at the Livestock Exchange on the 2nd Thursday of August, and it was that meeting which was the morning described at the beginning of this account, the one with the oppressive heat and the hush and Preston Garland at the far end near the auctioneer's stand with his laptop and his practiced smile. The room held 41 ranchers, the county extension agent, 2 representatives from the state agriculture department who had come in response to the concern letter, and the woman from the Harmon County paper who covered agricultural news and who had a recorder running on the table in front of her. The extension agent opened the meeting by describing the scope of the crisis, which everyone in the room understood already from living inside it, and then he invited Garland to present the fund's proposal, which was a regional water and feed supply agreement under which Consolidated Western Genetics would acquire management rights to 6 identified water-bearing properties in the county in exchange for guaranteed supply to participating operations through the duration of the drought and a right of first refusal on land sales for a period of 15 years. The properties identified in the proposal were listed in an appendix, and one of them was the Lisco Draw parcel, and the terms for it were $14,000 in a straw purchase agreement for Gideon's Genetics at a fee rate that was 40% below the prevailing market rate, pegged in the contract for the duration of a 15-year term. Garland presented this with the ease of a man who believes the numbers are already settled and the meeting is a formality. He said the fund was in a position to begin water delivery within 72 hours, that the hay supply chain was secured, and that this was the kind of coordinated regional response that small individual operators, however well-intentioned, could not accomplish on their own. He looked at Vera when he said well-intentioned with the warmth that was his best tool. He said the Lisco Draw, well at its permitted depth of 130 feet, was a good supplemental resource but not a primary source. For county-wide needs, and he said it with the confidence of a man reading from a document. The room was quiet for a moment after he finished, and Vera said from her seat in the third row that she would like to note a correction. She said the Lisco draw well was permitted at 180 feet, not 130, and that this was a matter of public record in the county permit filing, and she asked how Mr. Garland had arrived at the figure of 130. The room turned toward him. He said he believed he may have transposed figures from the document and that the precise depth was perhaps beside the point. She said it was precisely the point, and she asked the county extension agent to confirm the permitted depth from the public record, which the agent did from his own file copy, which read 180 feet. She said she raised the question not to embarrass anyone, but because if the fund's proposal was based on an assessment of the local water resources that was inaccurate, the ranchers in this room deserved to know that before they signed a 15-year right of first refusal on their land. One of the state agriculture representatives made a note. The woman from the paper kept her recorder running. She stood up then, which was not something she had planned to do or had planned precisely, and she said that she wanted to make a different kind of offer. She said she had hay at cost for any operation in the county that needed it, and she said she was prepared to truck water from the Lisco Draw windmill at no charge for livestock in critical condition, with the understanding that anyone who had a loader tractor they could bring to her place on Saturdays could help move hay, which was her way of making the arrangement a collaboration rather than a charity, because she had no interest in being owed, and every interest in not watching cattle suffer when she had the means to prevent it. She said she was not in a position to solve the county's water problem alone, but she was in a position to be one part of a network of people solving it together, and she invited anyone who had resources of any kind, hay, labor, water, a working pump, spare tanks, to speak up, because the county had more capacity than it was currently organizing, and what was needed was the organization, not the fund. 7 people spoke after her. 2 of them had hay. One had a water truck and an empty tank farm that could be refilled. One had an irrigation well with excess capacity. One had a neighbor in the next county with a hay broker contact who was holding back supplies for price reasons, and now that prices had peaked he might release them. The room arranged itself not perfectly and not without argument, but with the particular competence of people who know what they know and have been waiting for someone to stop telling them that what they know is insufficient. Preston Garland closed his laptop at some point during the second speaker and sat with the expression of a man calculating something, and the calculation apparently resolved unfavorably, because he gathered his materials before the meeting was concluded and left through the side door, which was the exit that avoided the parking lot where the state agriculture representatives were gathering their own materials, and which was also the exit that was nearest to his truck. Nobody stopped him, and nobody watched him go, because the room had better things to attend to. Irma Stassen was at the back of the room, which Vera had not noticed until the meeting broke up, and people were shaking hands and writing things down on the back of envelopes in the way of people who have a plan and no time to waste. Irma had not raised her hand to speak because she had nothing left to say publicly that she had not already said privately, and the things she had said privately had been enough. She found Vera at the end of the room and took her hand in both of hers, which were very small and very dry and very strong, and she said, in the gentle accented cadence of 81 years of knowing true things, that the ground grew what was planted in it, and that 14 months ago a woman arrived on the Lisco draw and planted something quiet and patient, and now the county was eating from it. And that was the right order of events, and it was always the right order. Vera said she thought Irma had known all along how it would come out. Irma said she had suspected, but the land had known, and the calf. She let go of Vera's hand and said she had pickled tomatoes on the truck and not to let her forget them. The rains came 11 days later, not as a single relieving event, but as a series of slow-soaking fronts that moved through the county over the course of a week, the kind of rain that does not run off because it falls at the pace the ground can absorb, and the fractured clay plates began to knit themselves back towards something workable, and the stock tanks filled to within 2 feet of capacity within a month. The Lisco draw ran clear and steady. Gideon stood in his paddock the morning after the first rain, with his face turned slightly into the changed air in the way of cattle who are reading something in the atmosphere that precedes the human perception of it, calm and deep-chested and fully himself. And Coy Dressel leaned on the fence rail next to Vera and said that Gideon always looks like he already knows how it comes out. Vera said she had heard that about him before. The boy said he thought Gideon should have a sign on his gate with his wins on it, so people coming down the road would know what was here before they even got out of their trucks. She said she thought the people who mattered already knew. He said he guessed that was true. They stood at the fence in the washed, new quiet of the morning after the rain and watched the Grand Champion graze. And the grass was very green, and the windmill turned in the light wind off the draw, and the water ran up from 180 feet of dark, cold certainty beneath them, and the land held what it had always held, patient and specific and entirely indifferent to what anyone had thought it was worth. She had paid $26 for the bottle calf nobody wanted. The arithmetic finally stated in full came out to something no ledger had a column for, which is a place where a woman alone becomes, by the simplest possible means, a woman who belongs.